Beneath a jungle canopy, where the sun barely reaches the earth, a team of scientists crawled into the darkness of Tamgu Hautu, the Cobra Cave. They weren't searching for treasure. They weren't looking for bones. What they found instead was a tooth. A single fossil, no larger than a fingernail, embedded in the silence of prehistoric Laos. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. But that tiny tooth belonged to a child, a girl who lived over 130,000 years ago. And she wasn't like us. She wasn't even Homo sapiens. She was Denisovan, a member of an ancient human species long believed to roam only the cold highlands of Siberia and the Tibetan Plateau. Until now, this tooth, hidden in the heart of a tropical jungle, changed everything. For decades, Denisovans were a shadow on the edge of science, known only from bone fragments and molars found in a Siberian cave, high in the Altai Mountains. Then, in 2019, the Tibetan Plateau gave us a second clue, a massive molar that hinted at their adaptability to altitude. But Laos? A humid, dense, sweltering rainforest? It made no sense. And that's exactly why it mattered. Using advanced protein analysis and 3D micro-CT scanning, researchers confirmed it. The tooth came from a Denisovan child, no older than 8. Its internal structure mirrored that of the Tibetan molar almost perfectly. This wasn't just a distant cousin. It was family, which meant Denisovans didn't merely survive the cold. They thrived in the heat. This girl's presence in Southeast Asia shattered old models of human dispersal. She proved that Denisovans weren't confined to the mountains of Central Asia. They were more widespread, more adaptable, more human than we had imagined. And if they lived in Laos, who else lived here with them? The fossil record hints at something astonishing, that during her time, at least 5 different human species may have coexisted in this region. Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis, modern Homo sapiens, and Denisovans. 5 human stories, all unfolding under the same sky. Some tall, some small. Some toolmakers, some island dwellers. Some, like her, already fading into extinction. She is the missing heartbeat in our shared past, and her story has just begun. As scientists prepare to extract DNA from a tooth, a deeper truth is waiting to be uncovered. Did she carry traces of Neanderthal ancestry? Did she leave descendants in modern Laotians? Or are her genes scattered in the bloodlines of Melanesians and indigenous Australians, populations already known to carry Denisovan DNA? This discovery isn't just about expanding a map. It's about rewriting our understanding of what it means to be human. That a girl who died over 130,000 years ago in a Laotian jungle might still whisper through the cells of people living today. In one tooth, we found an entire world. Deep in the tropical jungles of Southeast Asia, there exists a silent enemy of science. Heat, humidity, and relentless rain, the perfect recipe for destroying DNA. For decades, geneticists believed it was impossible to recover ancient human DNA from this region. The tropics were a black hole in our genetic maps. And yet, Laos defied the odds. In 2021, a groundbreaking team pushed the boundaries of science. From skeletal remains buried 8,000 years ago, they extracted ancient genomes. Not fragments, not contaminated samples, but full DNA sequences from prehistoric Southeast Asians, something once thought scientifically impossible. This wasn't just a technical achievement. It was a resurrection of voices lost to time. Because buried within those sequences were the ancestors of millions, hunter-gatherers, rice farmers, drifters, warriors, dreamers. Their genomes told stories that written history never recorded. The discovery revealed that modern Laotians, and Southeast Asians broadly, did not descend from a single wave of migration. Instead, they carry the blood of at least 4 ancient populations: the deeply rooted Hoabinian foragers, the East Asian rice farming migrants, early Austroasiatic speakers, and later Taikadai groups. It's not a single origin story. It's a convergence, a human symphony formed over 50,000 years. But how did this DNA survive? Laos offered a secret: caves, sheltered tombs with the right conditions, and relentless scientific innovation, from new sequencing methods to protein-based identification, cracked open the region's forgotten past. It marked a turning point. The dead zone of tropical Asia became a source of living memory. In that moment, Southeast Asia stepped onto the main stage of human evolutionary history, not as a follower, but as a genetic pioneer. Imagine a single person standing at the crossroads of four ancient rivers, each one carrying a different stream of human blood. That person is the modern Laotian. And those rivers? Hoabinhian hunter-gatherers, East Asian farmers, early Austroasiatic populations, and migrating Taikadai speakers. This is not metaphor. It is genetic fact. Genomic studies show that the people of Laos are not descended from one migration, or even two. Their DNA is a palimpsest, overwritten layer upon layer across tens of thousands of years. The Hoabinhian legacy is the oldest. Rugged foragers living in Southeast Asia 44,000 years ago. Their fingerprints remain in modern Lao mitochondrial DNA. They were masters of the jungle before the first farmer sowed a single grain. Then came the East Asian migrants, rice cultivators moving south from China, thousands of years later. But they didn't wipe out the foragers. They married them. Their children became something new, a synthesis of roots and reach. Austroasiatic languages, older than empires, brought more than vocabulary. They carried identity, myth, and bloodlines that stretch across Vietnam, Cambodia, and deep into Laotian hills. Finally, the Taikadai migration, roughly 2,000 years ago, arrived with its own cultural fire, metallurgy, state formation, and a new linguistic dynasty. But again, the incoming blood didn't replace the old, it blended with it. Modern Laos is not an origin point. It's a culmination, a living fusion of four ancient human paths, a genome written in four voices, singing in one language. On the misty islands of ancient Japan lived the Jaman people, hunter-gatherers whose lives echoed with ritual and rhythm. For centuries, they were thought to be isolated, the end of their own evolutionary branch. But recent genetic evidence draws a surprising line, from the caves of Laos to the forests of Jaman Japan. Researchers analyzing ancient genomes in Southeast Asia discovered a hidden link. The Hoabinhian hunter-gatherers of Laos shared deep ancestry with the Jaman. Separated by thousands of kilometers, these two groups likely descended from a common ancient population, long before East Asian farmers dominated the continent. What does this mean? That human migration wasn't always north to south. Sometimes it flowed east to the islands. These were seafarers, forest dwellers, perhaps connected by early trade or shared cosmology. Their DNA is the thread between two lost worlds. This discovery forces a radical rethinking. The genetic map of Asia is not linear. It is tangled, ancient, and alive with unexpected bridges. The past, it seems, was more connected than we ever imagined. For decades, archaeologists and linguists debated how the Taikadai languages, including modern Lao, spread across Southeast Asia. Did the people migrate, or did the language migrate without them? The genome gave the answer. A massive mitochondrial DNA study involving over 1,200 samples from Thailand and Laos confirmed a powerful truth. Taikadai-speaking peoples didn't just share language, they carried it in their blood. This was demic diffusion, real human migration from southern China, arriving between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago. These newcomers didn't erase the Austroasiatic populations already living in Laos. Instead, they absorbed them. Mitochondrial patterns show clear genetic blending, but with distinct maternal lineages arriving from the north. What makes this even more fascinating is the contrast. While maternal lines reflect the new migrants, paternal lines, through Y chromosome data, often reflect the older Austroasiatic base, a cultural fusion hidden in gendered genes. The Taikadai story isn't just about movement. It's about mixing, about how language, blood, and identity converge not in battle, but in birth. Laos is the child of that convergence. In a land known for its diversity of language, landscape, and ethnicity, the genetic reality of Thai-speaking Laotians is unexpectedly simple, homogeneous, consistent, unified. It is, in many ways, a paradox. While Laos is home to dozens of ethnic groups, Taikadai populations, despite their cultural dominance, show surprisingly little genetic variation. Genome-wide data reveals a pattern. Most share similar mitochondrial haplogroups and the same historical demographic signature. Why? The answer lies in the rapid, sweeping migration of Taikadai speakers during the Bronze and Iron Ages. These migrations weren't slow integrations. They were demographic waves, overwhelming in number, overwhelming in cultural power. Some scholars believe the homogeneity was driven by the Han Chinese expansions pushing southward, reshaping populations not just through politics or warfare, but through mass settlement. And yet, within that homogeneity lives complexity. It's not that these populations lack history. It's that their recent history was strong enough to smooth over the older layers. The story of Taikadai homogeneity is not about sameness. It's about momentum, about how a few thousand years can compress millennia of diversity, and how modern genetics is now peeling back that compression, one genome at a time. Laos, a country often seen as a quiet corner of Southeast Asia, carries a secret buried deep in its genetic code, a secret that ties it not just to East Asia, but far west to the Indian subcontinent. For centuries, historians have documented Indian cultural influences across Southeast Asia, temples, scripts, languages, epics. But genetics has now confirmed what monuments only hinted at. Several populations in Laos carry traceable South Asian ancestry, a silent echo of ancient maritime routes and forgotten kingdoms. Among the Laotian, the Khamuang, and the Austroasiatic-speaking Palong, a portion of their genome matches Indian lineages. These genetic footprints aren't recent. Some date as far back as 78 to 234 CE, during the rise of Indianized states like Funan in Cambodia. Others stem from medieval trade networks, spanning 600 to 800 years ago. This wasn't conquest. It wasn't colonization. It was integration. Merchants, monks, artisans, travelers from the Indian subcontinent settled in small numbers, intermarried, and left behind not just their customs, but their DNA. Modern Laotians, especially those near ancient trade corridors, still carry those markers. A few alleles in the genome, tiny strands, silently recall Sanskrit prayers, Bronze Age spice routes, and centuries of religious fusion. This Indian connection proves that Laos wasn't isolated. It was a living node in a vast, Pan-Asian network. And every heartbeat in today's Laos still carries a whisper of that global past. They once roamed in the hundreds of thousands. Towering, intelligent, sacred, Asian elephants were once the soul of Laos. The country's very name, Lane Zhang, means land of 1,000,000 elephants. But today, less than 1,000 remain. And the only thing standing between them and extinction is DNA. Scientists in Laos are using cutting-edge conservation genetics to rescue this fading legacy. The method is simple but powerful. Collect dung samples, extract DNA, and map each elephant's genetic identity. From just a handful of cells, they can determine gender, trace family lines, and track herd movements across remote forests. Why does this matter? Because elephant populations are collapsing. 10 deaths for every 1 or 2 births. If this pace continues, wild elephants in Laos could vanish within decades. But by identifying individuals, researchers can build informed breeding programs, monitor inbreeding, and even plan strategic reintroductions. It's ironic, almost poetic. The same genetic tools used to decode ancient human migrations are now preserving the very symbol of Laotian identity. In every elephant's genome lies the memory of old kingdoms, royal processions, jungle trails worn by centuries of migration. These aren't just animals. They're living history. And just like the Denisovan girl in Cobra Cave, their DNA carries a story worth saving. In the genome, every journey leaves a trail. But sometimes, the trails left by mothers and fathers don't match. And in Laos, that mismatch tells a profound story. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, reveals that Taikadai-speaking groups migrated into Laos from southern China around 2,000 years ago. This maternal migration is clear, visible in the genetic homogeneity of modern Lao women. They came in waves, women carrying agriculture, iron tools, and new cultural traditions. But the Y chromosome, passed from father to son, tells a different story. It speaks of continuity, of men who were already here, Austroasiatic-speaking, ancient, rooted in the land for millennia. While maternal genes reflect newcomers, paternal genes preserve the indigenous past. Why did this happen? Anthropologists believe cultural practices hold the answer. Matrilocal customs, where men move to the women's village after marriage, may have favored the survival of native Y-DNA, while maternal lineages came from elsewhere. This gendered genetic split isn't just biology. It's social history, a record of who moved, who stayed, who adapted, and who disappeared into the tides of time. It reveals how cultures merge not just through language or power, but through love, marriage, and generations of silent assimilation. In the Laotian genome, mothers brought the future, but fathers preserved the past. The tropics are death to DNA. Heat, humidity, and bacteria erased the past with every passing year. For decades, scientists believed ancient human DNA could not survive here. Laos was expected to be silent, a blank space on the genetic map, but Laos refused to stay silent. In recent years, researchers have done the impossible, extracting usable, even complete, genomes from bones buried in Laotian caves, some over 8,000 years old. This isn't just rare, it's revolutionary. Advanced techniques, including ultra-clean labs, protein profiling, and next-gen sequencing, have turned the impossible into discovery. Where once we saw decay, we now see memory. These breakthroughs didn't just unlock Laos. They changed the rules of tropical archaeology. Southeast Asia is now a live field, where new genomes are rewriting everything we assumed about population history, migration, and even human evolution. Laos cheated fate by holding on to its past, by preserving the unpreservable, by whispering back to science, we were never lost. You just hadn't learned to listen. From a single Denisovan tooth to the DNA of elephants, from ancient foragers to Tikadai farmers, from Indian traders to maternal migrations, the story of Laos is not a straight line. It's a spiral, a genetic mandala drawn over tens of thousands of years. This landlocked nation, often overlooked on modern maps, was once a global crossroads, a meeting point of species, of languages, of rituals. Its genome is layered like sediment, each one a timestamp of survival. Here, hominins crossed paths in humid jungles. Here, early farmers met ancient hunters and formed the first blended families. Here, the echo of Indian chants still pulses in mitochondrial strands. And here, elephants, ancient companions to humanity, still walk barely. In Laos, genetics isn't just a field of study. It's a lens into what it means to adapt, to merge, to persist. Because in the end, Laos isn't just a genetic case study. It's a living archive, a reminder that history doesn't belong to empires or textbooks. It belongs to blood, to bones, and to the quiet continuity of those who endure. And now that the science has learned to hear it, Laos is finally telling its story, in a language written in the code of life itself.